Well, our next guest is Jennifer Beckham. She's already lived an amazing life. I won't tell you all of her story, but she used to be a princess, a real-life princess, except it was for Walt Disney, and it was in Japan. That's all I'm going to tell you about that, because it's a great, great story. And let me just say this. Joni always tells me she's not a preacher, she's a sharer. So that means I can safely say that our next guest is the prettiest preacher that we've ever had on Celebration. Please join Joni and me as we welcome from Jacksonville, Florida, Jennifer Beckham. And Jennifer, you are a preacher, right?
Yes, sir. Yes.
All right. So from princess to preacher. So, and we're going to talk about your book here in a moment, Get Over Yourself. And I know Joni will have a lot of input about this because it deals so much with what girls and young ladies go through. But let's get over to Japan and tell us about you being a princess, and then you met the Prince of Peace. You met your real prince.
That's right. I thought I was there to be a Disney princess. I was raised in church all of my life. It wasn't until I was working for the Disney Corporation. I worked there at MGM Studios, which is now Hollywood Studios in Orlando. Worked there for several months through my college years, and shipped over to Japan. I was hired at Tokyo Disneyland to be a princess. And so I was there thinking that I was going solely to play Cinderella, Snow White, Mary Poppins, Belle, and Sleeping Beauty. And there were two little Baptist girls that were on cast with me this one day, January 14th, 1994.
And you'd been raised in Catholic church?
I'd been raised to know about God. My vision of God, my idea of God was that God was this huge being up in heaven just kind of shaking his head at me in frustration, just as frustrated with me as I was with myself, counting all the things that I was doing wrong. That was my vision of God. Went through Catholic school, all of those things. And not to say that all Catholics feel that way. I'm saying where I came from.
Right.
That's where I was in my life. And it wasn't actually until I was working for Disney that halfway through my contract, I was there age 18 and 19, you know, over there in a foreign country. And two little Baptist girls invited me to a Tokyo Dome to see Billy Graham preach. And to be honest with you, it wasn't that I was going because I knew that I needed to make a change. I knew that, but I didn't know how. And I was just grasping at straws, trying to find fulfillment in everything.
So now, before you went, did you know who Billy Graham was?
I did know who he was. I remember my dad reading books about him growing up. I remember seeing him. I knew who he was. But I didn't necessarily think that there was anything that I needed to do there at this Billy Graham crusade. But I knew that my alternative was to go home and to go into a bulimic fit that night and to have suicidal thoughts. I knew that there's got to be something. And so these girls, when they talked...
Wait a second. Why would... Here somebody's attractive, you're in this prominent position, you're a princess for Walt Disney. Why would you be doing all those self-destructive things?
Well, you know, Disney was my chase. There were so many chases that I had. I think women, I think we all go, but I think specifically women too, we go on a chase looking for fulfillment in things. And when we're not filled up, we're expecting that somehow we're going to reach something. If we could just get there then. And Disney was my next there and my next then. If I could just get on top of that float, then my life will make sense. I'll look in the mirror and I'll like what I see, and I'll be able to kind of deal with some issues in my life. And when I got up on top of that float, once again, it was just one more thing that I looked around and I thought, man, this, once again, here it is. I've reached my there and it's not there. And so I was just grasping at straws, and these girls had a light inside of them. They had something inside of them that when they walked through life, they were confident. When they talked about God, they talked about Jesus as though he was a best friend that was sitting right next to on a chair with them, hanging out with them every day.
And that made an impact on you?
I didn't know that God. I said, somehow we're knowing a different God, because the God I've been raised in all of my life is not that tangible Jesus that you're speaking of. And so I went with them, and we were sitting there in the Tokyo Dome, and I just looked over at the two girls that brought me there, and I said, I need to go down there. And I walked down flights and flights of stairs in the Tokyo Dome to find a post in the ground with the word English written on it so that somebody in my own language in a foreign country could lead me to Jesus Christ.
So folks, to put this in perspective, Japan, at least back then, would have been less than 1% Christian.
Absolutely.
The Tokyo Dome seats like 60 or 70,000 people. So this is really something that the Lord followed you all the way to Japan to arrest you.
Absolutely.
So when you went down there and you prayed with an English-speaking counselor, what happened to you?
I remember everything opening up for me. In that moment, it was almost like it all made sense. And it sounds so funny, but they showed me this little card, and it should have been something I've seen a million times because I was raised up in church and raised up in Catholic school. But they showed me this little card where it was that Jesus was this bridge between us and God. And literally, it was the cross. You've seen it a million times. Our viewers have seen it a million times. That cross, that bridge, that gap between me as a sinner and a holy God. And the amazing thing was, when I looked at that, it was like a light bulb went off, and it was my aha moment. It was that moment that I just went, I get it. I need Jesus. Without him, I'm going to search everywhere, in the next bed, in the next boyfriend, in the next, party, in the next trophy, on the next float. And it's not going to be anywhere unless it's with Jesus. And that's where I found him. And it all just made sense.
Now, of course, we're going to fast forward. Now you have your second prince, and Mr. Anthony. He is an evangelist, and y'all travel and minister together?
We do. We've been on the road. First of all, we went from strangers to married in 8 weeks. Now, mind you, I had
oh my goodness.
Yeah.
But and you don't recommend that, do you?
I don't. I always say, please don't try that at home. Yeah. But the thing is I was still, even though I was saved, I was still looking for quick fixes in my life. There were still some very deep-rooted issues that had not been settled. I had not dug out some issues and gotten deliverance over some things, gotten completely restored, and those things just kept bubbling up. So I was still into quick fixes, and I thought that, hey, this guy is, represents everything that I want to be, but I'm striving for and can't seem to get it. And so I wouldn't recommend it, but God had his way. And then, here I am married to a Church of God preacher and
how many
traveling.
years now you've been married?
Almost 14. This year will be 14 and 2 children later. So we got married, we went out onto the road, and that's actually when the Lord started kind of speaking to me about, okay, you're doing all the right things, you're saved, you're married to a preacher, you're doing all the right things, but you need to get over yourself. You need to learn to go back before you keep trying to move forward. And so that's what Get Over Yourself is about.
Joni?
So tell us a little bit about that title, Get Over Yourself, for those who are listening today. What did you mean by that? Get Over Yourself is,
I get a lot of emails about that title, but it's really not about getting over the pride issues. I don't think any woman would look at themselves and say that they're prideful. I think we put ourselves last all of the time. But at the time, when God spoke that to me, what he was saying was, since we take life so personally, even though we're not supposed to sometimes, the things in life are personal, and we get stuck. We get stuck in the pain, in the shame. Most of the time, in the shame that is associated with a sin we've already been forgiven of. We've been forgiven, but we're still carrying around the shame. And in my life specifically, I was still caught up in yesterday. My father had died at the age of 14, something that I had never grieved over, something I'd never really dealt with. And when I was trying to deal with the pain of that, I ran to stuff to try to fill a void. And it wasn't until I came to know Jesus Christ that I understood what can fill the void, which was Jesus, and only Jesus and his love. But the problem was I still had deep-rooted issues that I needed to get beyond so that God could show me how to walk that out and how to walk into what he had planned for my life.
So it's almost like you're saying there were things that God had to take you back to before you could really progress forward.
Absolutely.
And so how were you able to deal with those issues? How were you able to recognize what those issues were?
Well, he brought me, the book is 7 Principles to Get Over Yourself and On With Your Destiny, and it was a roadmap that God had given me. He brought me back to a moment in time there at Disney that I didn't recognize 14 years prior. And it was something that my boss, Tommy, had said to me. And it was a day that I was struggling. I was bulimic, looking for love in all the wrong places, dressing up like a princess during the day, and at night suicidal. Wow. Just horrible, horrible, different life I was living from day to night. And what he said to me one day was, I walked into work, didn't want to be there, needed to go be a princess, Cinderella of all days, a princess, while inside I'm dying. Being pretty on the outside, dying on the inside. He grabbed my hand, spun me around, looked at me and goes, "What's wrong with you? You don't look so good." I was hired to be perfect, He said, "You don't look so good." And I said, "I'm fine. Just let me get my makeup on." He didn't buy it. He looked into my face, and this is what he said to me. He said, he said, "I need to know what's going on with you. You don't look right." And I said, "Tommy, I don't feel like doing this today. I don't feel like a princess. I don't feel like being here, okay?" And that's in that moment that he looked at me. He cleared his voice. And he looked into my eyes and he said, "Whoever asked you to feel, you were chosen to be a princess.
Wow.
Now go, wash your face, get a new attitude, go put on your clothes, and go be Cinderella, because nobody ever asked you to feel anything." And in that moment,
that's pretty good preaching.
You know what? All it was him telling me to get back to work. He was frustrated. 14 years later, here I'm in ministry. Here I'm trying to figure out what's wrong with me. I'm doing the right things, but I'm still messed up to the core. And that's what God spoke to me. And he gave me those principles. And what he said was, I want you to walk through every one of those steps. Tommy said, whoever asked you to feel, you were chosen, go, wash your face, get a new attitude, go put on your clothes, and go be Cinderella. And those steps right there is what he had me walk through. I went to the Bible. He spoke 4 people to me, David, Esther, Aaron, and Ruth. And I found out scripturally that every one of those, to get to their destiny, they had to go wash their face, anoint themselves to get a new attitude, and go put on their clothes so they could step into the calling that God gave them. 14 years later, when my boss said that to me, it wasn't biblical. 14 years later, here it is. And so it's those are the steps we walk through in the book.
Okay, you talk about in the book about the box. Tell me about that.
You know, it's something that resonates no matter where I go. 6 years later, I'll run into a lady that says, wow, I'll never forget the box story. And it's so simple, but on our very first day of work, Tommy brought all of us into the green room. And there were 6 of us girls that were hired to play those characters. And we had 4 other girls that played the short characters, Wendy, Alice, Ariel, all of those. And it may sound silly, but standing there at the green room ready to start our day in this dream job, Tommy has a stack of boxes, and inside of those boxes were all the hair bows and makeup that we needed to complete our outfits. It was a cardboard box. It meant nothing more than hair, bows, and makeup. But he took the box, it had our name on it, and he looked at us, and as every girl came into the green room, we walked in, and he took our respective boxes, he handed them to us, and this is what he said. He said, everything that you need to be what you were called here to be is inside of that box. If it's not in there, you don't need it. The next girl walked in, he took her box, gave it to her, and he made it a point to do that to each and every one of us. Tommy was one of the ones that flew halfway across the world to choose those 6 girls out of thousands. So he knew what he was looking for when he chose us, and he knew what he was doing when he put our boxes together.
Aww.
And he looked over at us, and that's what he said. And at the time, it just meant that we looked inside of that box and we started trying on this makeup. But the bottom line was Tommy walked in because what we stopped doing is looking at our own boxes and we started looking at everybody else's. I noticed that there were some girls that had some other things in their boxes I didn't have in mine. And so the room got chaotic. Tommy walks in and says, what's going on? And I said, well, Tommy, I think you guys left some stuff out of my box. You know, there's stuff in here, but there's some things that I don't have. You missed some things. And he looked at me and he said, I told you that everything that you need to be you is inside of you, and if it's not inside that box, and if it's not in there, you don't need it. And at the time, Tommy just wanted me to stop. But when God spoke that to me later in ministry, he reminded me about that box, and he said, Jennifer, I didn't call you to be a singer. I didn't call you to be all the things that you compare yourself to every day. What I've called you to be is you. And everything that you need to be you is inside of you, and if it's not in there, you don't need it. Sometimes the greatest gift in our own boxes is the pain that we've walked through, the ugly gifts, as I call them. And sometimes we don't have a beautiful singing voice like you, Joni. Sometimes we don't have a wonderful leadership quality like you do, Marcus. Sometimes what we have in our box is pain, shame, hurt, and those things can be redeemed for the glory of God just the same. God can take the pain of our life.
He can use them to bless others.
Amen.
Well, we're running out of time today, but I want to encourage you to get the book, get out of yourself, get over yourself. Don't get out of yourself. I was thinking about the box. Get out of the box. Yeah. But anyway, get over yourself. JenniferBeckham.org. She and her husband, Anthony, do ministry together. Plus, she does motivational, inspirational engagements on her own, come to speak to women's groups, youth groups, etc. So I encourage you, especially if you've got a young lady in your life. I hope I can get Rachel and Rebecca to read this. They're 20 and 18, and you deal a lot of, like some of the things young people go through, girls, like bulimia and the cutting and the self-image problems and all of that. So the information's there. It'll be a blessing to you, and I encourage you to get it.